All right, today we're going to talk about a piece of American law that's, well, it's super important, but you've probably never even heard of it. It's called the Posse Comitatus Act. Think of it as this invisible wall that separates soldiers from police officers. And as we're about to see, a recent court ruling might have just taken a sledgehammer to that wall.
So, let's just ask the big question right up front. Can the U.S. military act as a police force on American soil? I mean, can you use the most powerful military in the world to police its own citizens? The answer is supposed to be a hard no. But lately, that line has gotten really, really blurry.
And that's exactly what brings us to the news that makes this whole topic so urgent. Just this past year, in 2025, a federal judge dropped a bombshell of a ruling. The court found that the government did exactly that. It used the military for domestic policing. And in doing so, it broke a law that's been on the books for nearly 150 years.
Okay, so Section 1, a line was crossed. Let's really dig into what the court said here. Because this wasn't just some, slap on the wrist. The judge basically declared that a fundamental line in American democracy had been ignored. And this whole legal showdown, it all comes down to this one law, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. So you might be asking, what is that? To really get why this ruling is such a big deal, we have to understand the law itself.
All right, Section 2, the Posse Comitatus Act. So let's break it down. What is this law, and why was it created in the first place? Why is it supposed to be this huge safeguard for all of us?
At its heart, the act is actually pretty simple. It draws a really clear line, a wall basically, between the military and civilian police. It says the U.S. Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they just can't be used as a domestic police force. We're talking about things like making arrests or doing crowd control. Now, there are exceptions, but they have to be explicitly authorized by the Constitution or an act of Congress.
Okay, now this is where it gets kind of interesting because there are some nuances. So on one side, you've got the branches that are restricted by the Act, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force. You get it. But then you look at the other side. Who's exempt? Well, the Coast Guard for one, since it has a specific law enforcement role. And then there's the National Guard. This is the tricky one. When it's under a governor's control for state emergencies and stuff, the Act doesn't apply. But, and this is a huge but, the second the president federalizes the Guard, boom, it falls right under the restrictions of the Act.
Section 3, birth of a law. So to really get why this law even exists, we have to jump in a time machine and go way back. We're talking about the super chaotic years right after the Civil War. This law wasn't just invented out of thin air. It was forged in a time of incredible national turmoil.
Yeah, this timeline really shows how it was like a perfect storm of events. So the Civil War ends in 1865, right? And for the next decade, federal troops are occupying the South during Reconstruction. But then, in 1877, there's this big political deal, the Compromise of 1877, and the troops are pulled out. But get this, just a few months later, those same troops are sent in to crush the Great Railroad Strike. And that freaked everybody out, not just in the South, but all over the country. And that was the spark. It created this huge push from both parties to pass the act in 1878.
So, you see, there were a bunch of things happening all at once. For Southern Democrats, it was absolutely about ending what they felt was a humiliating military occupation. For a lot of people in the North, the energy for Reconstruction was just gone. But the biggest thing, the thing underneath it all, was this really deep, historic American fear. A fear that goes all the way back to the founders of a powerful standing army being used against its own people.
But we have to be really clear about something. The law had a dark side and an immediate, terrible consequence. When those federal troops were pulled out, it also removed the main protectors of voting rights for newly freed African Americans in the South. So the passage of this act, it effectively slammed the door shut on Reconstruction, and it absolutely helped pave the way for the whole era of Jim Crow laws.
Okay, Section 4, a modern courtroom battle. So, with all that history in our back pocket, let's jump back to the present day. Now we can see exactly what was on the line when this 150-year-old law was put to the test in a modern courtroom.
So the date is September 2025, and the scene is a federal courtroom. The judge is looking at the actions taken by the Trump administration during major protests in Los Angeles, and the central question before the court was simple. Did the deployment of federalized troops onto city streets cross that legal line?
And the judge's answer was loud and clear. Judge Charles Breyer didn't just say the deployment violated the law. He found that the administration violated the Posse Comitatus Act willfully. And that one word, willfully, is everything. It means this wasn't some accident, it wasn't a mistake or a misreading of the law, it was a deliberate choice.
So here's how the court broke down its reasoning. First, the judge said there was no rebellion or insurrection. That's one of the only constitutional loopholes, and it just didn't apply here. Second, the troops weren't just standing guard outside a federal building. No, they were out there performing actual police duties, crowd control, traffic control, that kind of thing. And third, and this is a big one, evidence showed that the administration knew the law and actively tried to find ways around it, even telling officials exactly what words to use to try and justify the military presence.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing in Los Angeles. This was part of a much bigger pattern. There were similar situations, or at least threats to deploy troops, in places like Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Portland. In fact, another federal judge in a separate case also ruled that the D.C. deployment was illegal. So that just adds even more weight to what happened in the California court.
Okay, Section 5. Why this law still matters. So after all that, we get to the big question, right? Why does a law from the 1870s, passed because of the Civil War and railroad strikes, still matter so much today? Why should you care?
Well, because the core idea here is absolutely timeless. The Posse Comitatus Act is like a firewall. It's designed to make sure that the people enforcing our laws are civilians, accountable to their own communities, not soldiers who are trained for war. It's all about preserving this fundamental idea that the military's job is to protect the nation, not to police it. The moment that line gets blurry, the line between a free society and a militarized one gets blurry too.
And what these recent court battles show us is that this firewall, it's fragile. It's constantly being tested. And that really brings us back to the central tension of this whole thing. As we face new challenges, new crises, the fundamental question is still there, and every generation has to answer it for themselves. Where exactly do we draw the line between military power and civilian life?